Good afternoon, everyone. This is absolutely phenomenal. What time is it? It's 4:45. I assume that most of you guys would be out there trying to make your tan look like my tan right now. Well, as you know, the theme of this meeting has been advocacy, activism, and leadership, and in fact, what I call boundary-spanning leadership. And that boundary-spanning leadership is this concept that we can form alliances, allegiances across many domains that may be vertical or horizontal, in which we can work toward a higher goal. I have lived a blessed life, and a part of that blessing has been the relationships of people that I've been in contact with. And so when I thought about this as our theme 2 years ago, I wanted to get Brian Stevenson, who you saw, and I wanted to get some of my friends, my boys and my girls in my life to speak in the realm of this concept of leadership. I got some formal introductions, but I'm not going to really go through a lot of that formality. I mean, when you're with your friends and you're introducing them, you don't introduce them by achievements, you introduce them by spirit. But I will start before I do that to explain who we have here and why we have them here. In 1982, I was a second-year Harvard medical student with Henri Ford, and we were rotating through the Brigham and Women's, 82, 83, and there was this kind of sharp guy, neatly coiffed, really slick, who was kind of like Mr. Everything, and that was Kurt Newman. And I knew at an early age this guy from North Carolina, right? You're from Carolina, right? Because I remember you wore the light blue. Even though I'm from Virginia, I like the light blue. So I got a chance to meet Kurt Newman, and from the moment I met him, as often is the case, there's something special. And so Kurt is currently the CEO of Children's National in Washington, D.C., as many of you know, and he's one of us, and so I only have people who are one of us, pediatric surgeons. And so he will talk about his role, and you have seen the objectives for this. The second person that is here is Dr. Francisco Cigorroa, Siggy, as I know him. We have been friends since literally July 1st, 1984, when I started on the West Surgery Service at the Mass General Hospital, much like this week has been for me. When I started that weekend, it was a Sunday, that July 1st, it was like both drinking from a water hose and being waterboarded at the same time. But Francisco, as he's been his entire career, whether it's in Texas, whether it's starting 2 medical schools, Francisco is the guy that jumps in front of the water so that people can breathe and so that they can develop. And he was an essential part of me being successful in a place that was very tough. The third person we have here is probably also someone who needs no introduction. It is, how do I say it, Henri Ford. Henri is someone I've known since 1976, when we met as kids in a program for underprivileged kids in New York City. And I knew Henri when he was Henri. And so I did. And we spent 6 weeks in an enrichment program in New York City. And I hope it's okay to say this, Henri. He's done it, I haven't. But we quipped and bragged about one day changing the world. He has. I've been following in his wake. But this was when we were 17-year-old boys. And 4 years later, Yale, Princeton, after that we went to Harvard Medical School together. And he convinced me 10 years after that to come to Pittsburgh for my first faculty job. And he's the godfather of one of my children. It goes on and on. And then finally we have Dr. Ayla Stanford. I sometimes can't get too close to her now because her star is so bright now with the remarkable things that she has done during this era of the COVID pandemic. As you recognize, the virus has laid bare the systemic inequities that plague our country that we have now become more comfortable talking about. So without further ado, I will present to you our group who will talk about leadership from the bedside, clinical bedside, to the boardroom, and the strategies that they have used in order to move from success to significance to impact outside of the realm of pediatric surgery. Dr. Newman?
That's great. Well, thank you, Ed, and it's great to be with you all. You know, we're all together. It feels like coming home, seeing all friends, colleagues, and I just can't tell you how honored I am and humbled to be part of this session. I started out like most of you, and so that's kind of what I looked like when I was a surgeon. That was who Ed and Henri, when they were second-year medical students. I can tell you they were good in the classroom, but they had a lot of work to do on the wards. And we got them buffed up pretty good. Ed did do me the honor of recognizing my North Carolina roots. When I got up to Boston, I got a nickname. They called me Flash because I was so slow.
Wasn't going to say that.
I know you weren't going to say that. You're a respectful guy. But my goal, like all of you, was to then go to Washington and pursue training and a career in pediatric surgery. It was just, you know, the highest calling. And it was fantastic. I just loved it. And then had the opportunity to stay on the staff at Children's National and join a group of terrific surgeons. One of my mentors is here, Kathy Anderson, who I really learned everything there was to know about pediatric surgery. And thank you, Kathy. But as I was practicing surgery, I took on some roles, some leadership roles, whether it was helping build a quality and safety program for the hospital, or getting involved with fundraising and getting into the community and raising resources for the hospital, not just surgery. And it was just really exciting to be able to tell stories from what was going on in the hospital, from the front lines, to motivate people to support what we were doing. So about 11 years ago, maybe a little before that, it was clear there were going to be some leadership changes at Children's National. There was going to be a search for a new CEO. I was working with an executive coach. And I thought, you know, there might be some things that I could bring from the front lines, from the bedside, as Ed has designed this, to the boardroom or the C-suite or to the leadership role that could make a difference. Because I was chief of surgery, and that was a great job. It's probably one of the greatest jobs there is. But I was getting frustrated because there was a level above that was sometimes getting in the way. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to take a crack at this and see what happens. I'd never been anywhere else, 30 years at Children's National. And I thought Children's National, being the children's hospital in Washington, D.C., and I was looking at the trends around the country, and a lot of independent children's hospitals were merging into adult health systems, that we as an independent children's hospital could make even more of a difference and have a bigger say and voice on children's issues. So part of it was doing more for surgery and pediatric surgery. Part of it was doing more for kids in Washington, D.C., and part of it was doing more for pediatrics and children in our nation, because if you see my sort of glamour shot there with the Capitol behind, we have a unique perspective and opportunity to make a difference. So I thought that frontline experience and that credibility would make, I'd make my case on that. I didn't have an MBA, not a lot of the trappings that people usually have in these kinds of positions, but I knew our hospital, I knew our community, I knew what needed to be done. I'd been there in the trenches in the emergency department, late at night, weekends, knew where the weaknesses of the hospital were, and knew the market, knew all the other hospitals in healthcare. And I thought, you know what? I think this is a great job, and it worked out for me. So I've been the CEO now for 11 years, almost 11 years, and it's been terrific. I'm going to just give you 3 or 4 points of how I took to follow the framework here of things that I learned, that I've put into place. But I can tell you just about everything I've done has come from my background of being a surgeon, being a pediatric surgeon, and working in our hospital, and finding solutions and taking that on. So, one thing is I wanted to emphasize is the importance of the team and top talent. In our pediatric surgery department, under Dr. Randolph's leadership and Kathy Anderson that I mentioned, I was surrounded by great talent. I never even thought about that I wasn't around world-class talent, and I saw what that meant for a pediatric surgery department. I also had the privilege of being a fellow with 2 spectacular other fellows on either side of me. So that's the picture of the wall there. But Bob Connors was actually the first president of a children's hospital that I know of. So ironically, and he was before me in Michigan. And then Mary Fallett, who many of you know, a former president and just spectacular leader here in pediatric surgery. And then on that wall, if you look over there down to the side and to the left, there's David Powell, who's next year's president of this organization, and many leaders. So I was just surrounded by talent. I saw what that meant. I saw what we could learn, and and that part of my job as a CEO was to get top talent, whether it was in surgery or anesthesia or psychiatry or social work or environmental services, wherever it was, we wanted the top people. And, you know, that has created a culture of excellence. We're not going to tolerate things that don't work. So this is the current division of pediatric surgery there with Dr. Sandler as the surgeon-in-chief. We were awarding the Randolph Fellowship to our fellow, and Dr. Hayes, another spectacular leader here, now chair of surgery at Howard University, was our speaker. And that's the department, and Phil Gazzetta you see there too, and just a spectacular group of surgeons. I do tell people, you know, when you're in a CEO role, you can't have favorites, but I've got favorites. One is surgery, and you know why. We all know why. And one is the NICU, because that's where I met my wife. So she was a neonatal nurse practitioner. And then that's my leadership team there, and it's just a spectacular team. I'm fortunate, and I just went out to find the best people in each of the areas. And it's a little bit like a team of rivals, if you know that book. They've got strong personalities. They're, you know, quick to disagree with things sometimes, but like a good set of surgeons, once we leave the room, we're all on the same team. We can disagree, but once we leave the room, we're on the same team, and that's just totally benefited our progress and our strategy. Another one was the value of data, outcomes, and transparency. Every surgeon that's been in a morbidity and mortality conference or peer review knows what it means to sit around that table and have to open up about what you did wrong. or what you could have done better. And I took that ethos with me because it made such a big difference. This is a picture. I meet every 2 weeks, and we go over all of the serious events, other issues that have come up with our leadership team. And they better be ready because I know the hospital. They can't, you know, they can't fake it. I know what goes on. I also learned early the value of data. Todd Ponsky, medical student at George Washington, or surgery resident at George Washington, worked with me, and we took some data, and this was 20-some years ago, took the FIS, or 18 years ago, took the FIS database, got a paper published in JAMA, but it was taking this data and really analyzing, not just case by case, which is what we were doing in M&M, but looking at trends and across. And so putting that as when I became CEO, I wanted to look at our trends and I wanted to be transparent about it. So look at this, 2009, if the SSE rate is, it's just a measure of serious safety events that happen per patient day, per bed patient day. And look at that. That was just inexcusable, but it was being tolerated. So we put a lot of stuff into it, but the main thing was we were going to be transparent about it. We were going to talk about it. We were going to get into these cases, find out what's wrong. And look what we've been able to do, and that rate has come down over time to where it is today, 10 years later. Now the other graph, again, is based on these kinds of outcomes. So it's not labeled, but that's our U.S. News & World Report overall ranking for children's hospitals. So we went, I think we were number 18 and maybe dropping when I came in. But because of all the great work of our teams and improving the care and the outcomes and following protocols and really making the care excellent, we got up into the top 10. And it just shows those lessons that we all know from surgery. When you take it to a broader perspective, you can make a big difference. Because a lot of the other disciplines don't think that way. You know, they're not thinking system-wise, or they're not looking at things from the emergency department, or maybe even from the referring pediatrician all the way through the system. So another lesson I learned early on was how to tell stories. And when you combine being able to tell stories, and all of you have great stories, and you get really, really close to your patients and your families, and they're incredibly grateful to you. So when the right circumstances come together and you're ready with that story, you can make big things happen. And I've been lucky enough to be able to do that a few times, because we all know the finances of pediatric healthcare in this country are not perfect. So we rely on philanthropy, and we rely on our grateful families. So here was a case, again, it's an extraordinary situation, but these two gentlemen, one was a close friend, a worldwide businessman, multi-billionaire, Joe Robert, and that's the ambassador from the United Arab Emirates. And both of them Joe's son was my patient, and then Ambassador Alo Taiba, there were many families from the UAE that we'd taken care of. And we came up with this big idea to really make focus investment in pediatric surgery research and innovation. I was troubled that that was not on the same par as a lot of the medical issues. And so this is a way to jump forward, and we came up with this idea of a pediatric surgical Center for Pediatric Surgical Innovation. And that became the Sheikh Zayed Institute for Pediatric Surgical Innovation. Tony Sandler there is the head of that, as well as chief of surgery. And it's just going great guns. Lots of research, lots of grants, companies being spawned out of that. Because of that experience, when I became CEO, we wanted to take it even to a bigger level and broaden it across pediatrics in general. Again, I was disturbed when I became CEO to see that as I started looking broader at issues, that pediatric research in general was not getting its due in terms of investment. So there we are with the mayor of Washington, D.C. and the head of Johnson & Johnson. We had this big idea about a pediatric innovation campus. There's lots of innovation campuses across the country, very notable, but there's not one focused on children. And here we are in Washington, D.C. We got the NIH, we got the FDA, we've got all these medical schools and everything. So we came up with this idea of a pediatric innovation ecosystem and campus. I'm happy this was the old Walter Reed Army Medical Center campus. They closed down the base. We were able to secure some of the land. On this side, on the left side, that's what's open now. And I invite you all to come visit it with multiple startup companies, Children's National's own research, some clinics, Virginia Tech. And that's what the future looks like. It's based right in our nation's capital. So we can make those cases to the people that matter. But finally, the real lesson that I learned, and I said it before, was everything I learned about being in a leadership role was from the OR, from the emergency department, from working with my colleagues, to having big ideas. That's all rooted in taking care of patients and keeping children at the center of everything we do. That's our mantra, that's our approach, and it keeps us centered. This is a patient of mine, Tyler. I actually met him on the OR table on his first day of life. Operated on him probably 20 or 30 times, different things. And then that's him later on. We never thought he was going to be able to even live to that age. But I went to his high school graduation, to his wedding, and then there he is with a healthy baby son. That is what it's all about. And when you keep that in mind, you'll make the right decisions. The finances will follow. The strategies will come together. The people will join in. And you'll feel this, as Ed mentioned, you'll feel that tremendous satisfaction of making an impact. For some people, it's making an impact every day, taking care of kids and families. Others have different ways of doing that, and we're going to hear about that. But I've been honored to have this opportunity. I'm thrilled to be back here with all of my friends and colleagues, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Spectacular. Thank you. I want a copy of that.
And by the way, if you want to learn more, I did write a book, and full disclosure, but I don't get any money from it. It all goes to research. Thank you.
Surprised you a little bit with this picture. This isn't in your slide deck, so.
Well, there I am, with you right there as well, Ed. So, well, first of all, Ed, I want to thank you very much for including me in this fireside chat on leadership, together, with our esteemed colleagues. On a personal note, as you heard from Ed, he's a chosen brother of mine, because he and I have spent a considerable time together as residents at Massachusetts General Hospital, where we learned a lot from each other, Ed. And it also gives me immense pride that he is the president of APSA, in recognition by his colleagues for his remarkable contribution to the health of our children and to our discipline. He and I very well know that each one of you today are inherent leaders, and that you can make a remarkable difference for those around you. We live in a time of internal and external social conflict, a tremendous amount of misinformation, and unfortunately, inevitable polarization. But the most powerful prescription to remedy these social maladies, in my opinion, is education. The opening of minds. igniting the leadership potential of individuals with goodness in their heart, and a moral compass considering every person regardless of background. Every member of this educated society can help restore a balance in these times that we live in today. Our nation, no doubt, is beckoning us to get out of comfort zones, to make a difference not only for our individual patients, but for society at large. In my case, I was most comfortable at the patient's bedside or in the operating room. And little did I ever know I was going to be tapped to become president of the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio 5 years out of fellowship, and then subsequently chancellor of the University of Texas system, leading one of the largest educational systems in the world. I also did not know that my liberal arts education and training as a surgeon forged the leadership attributes and the skills required to be an effective leader in higher education and beyond. Namely, those are discernment into the essence of different subjects, the ability to write and articulate effectively, and to interact with individuals who had contrasting points of view that I had to grapple with and deeply process. So my training as a pediatric and as a transplant surgeon made me a good listener, an effective planner to overcome unexpected challenges in the operating room, understanding that success requires a team, and the importance of continual improvement and accountability when desired outcomes are not met, and that we need to make decisions based on good judgment with the information that we have at hand. These were exactly the attributes that permitted me to appreciate success as a president of a comprehensive academic health center, and then chancellor of the University of Texas system. Both these two roles were well beyond the orbit of my comfort zone. Well, leadership comes in many forms and is affected by many life experiences. Any success that I have appreciated to date has been a result of my upbringing along the Texas-Mexico border region in a city by the name of Laredo, Texas. The personal support from my family and friends, like Ed and other members here on this panel, and the influence of my mentors on me. These life experiences also influenced decisions I made in the interest of improving the quality of life and the human potential of others. As a pediatric surgeon, I understand how important an education is for the overall health of a child, and importantly, for their dignity throughout life. I'm convinced that education is among one of the greatest public health initiatives, and that every child should have a high-quality education no matter their background. A lack of consistency in high-quality public education in the United States is still one of the greatest forms of inequality in our nation. So growing up on the Texas-Mexico border allowed me to learn two cultures and the beauty of the United States and the beauty of Mexico. In Laredo, many leaders were Mexican-American, and I never thought, not even for 1 second, that one could not achieve their highest potential if you were an underrepresented minority. In fact, cities along the Texas border were 90% Hispanic, so when I went from among one of the poorest public school systems in the United States to Yale, I never conceived of failure. However, I very quickly learned that I was woefully underprepared from an educational perspective when I entered Yale. But doing poorly was not an option for me, as I did not want to disappoint my parents or those who believed in me. So success at Yale required that I develop a discipline to catch up to my peers and then eventually excel. And this discipline remains to date and has allowed me to navigate various challenges. Growing up in Laredo also gave me the opportunity to spend many years with my grandfather in Mexico, where he was a rancher raising cattle and stewarding the land. In my grandfather's ranch, I became friends with Mexican cowboys, otherwise known as vaqueros. Correct, Alberto? Son vaqueros. and their children, and I learned about their aspirations and their love of the land and wildlife. These life experiences made a profound difference in how I developed policies across the UT system, assuring we opened our educational doors to our neighbors in Mexico. I also learned the huge health challenges facing the citizens of the Texas-Mexico border, which eventually led me to establish the new university in South Texas named the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, with its associated School of Medicine. This action fulfilled a lifelong dream of my father, who practiced medicine for over 60 years in Laredo, Texas. His one regret as a physician was not being able to teach the next generation of medical students. Establishing a medical school in South Texas will now eliminate that one regret for other physicians who want to teach medical students in this region of the United States. When I received my doctorate of medicine at UT Southwestern Medical School, and it was also at UT Southwestern that I learned the importance of mentorship. In my third year of medical school, Dr. Michael Brown was my attending on the internal medicine clinical rotation. One day, he asked me if I could have a snack with him at the vending machines in the hospital over some Twinkies. Strawberry Twinkies were Dr. Michael Brown's favorites, and I pretended I liked them, but I hated them. He asked me what my aspirations were for my career, and I told him I wanted to return to Laredo and practice surgery. And he asked me whether I ever thought about academic medicine. And I even asked him, well, what is that? In the end, he encouraged me to apply to the surgical residency at the MGH because that would give me the option to pursue either academic medicine or be able to go back to Laredo. He wrote my letter of recommendation, and when I told him I got accepted, he told me not to disappoint him as he vouched for me. I immediately felt a great responsibility to succeed. And when I became chancellor of the UT system, he was very, very proud. And I asked him whether I've disappointed him. And he said, not yet, but there is time. And he grinned, and my nervousness did not abate. So in other words, mentors inspire you to do your very best. And for your information, Dr. Michael Brown, the Twinkie eater, eventually shared the Nobel Prize with Dr. Joseph Goldstein for his work on hypercholesterolemia. At MGH and at Hopkins, I learned the ethos of excellence in patient care and the importance of lifelong mentorship, which Dr. Gerald Austin, then chairman of surgery, provided to all of his residents. I learned from Patricia Donahoe the importance of translational science. I learned at Hopkins from Dr. Paul Colombani that if you wanted to pursue pediatric transplantation, you should do a transplant surgical fellowship. Well, suddenly I was seriously being considered to become president of the UT Health Science Center San Antonio 4 years out of fellowship. So I traveled to Boston to ask Dr. Austin for his advice. He encouraged me to pursue the presidency as he believed I could make a real difference in South Texas and that I had untested potential. He believed that MGH and Hopkins gave me all the leadership skills to be a great president. He also advised me not to stop doing surgery throughout my administrative career. He stated it will make you a better administrator because individuals and your faculty and students will see you on the front lines. And then he paused and he said, it's also a good idea because you never know. I didn't know what that meant. But he goes, well, you're untested. And if things do not work out, you haven't burned any bridge. And he also grinned, just like Michael Brown. Well, continuing to practice surgery, albeit a bit more limited, allowed me to have the courage to make complex decisions where others would be indecisive. My career and happiness were not dependent on administration. I also learned much from Dr. Austin about the importance of diversity, inclusion, equity. He made the decision to make me and then Dr. Barksdale to become super chief residents of the West Surgical Service at a time when no previous Latino or no previous Black had ever served in those roles at the MGH. It was a powerful message to surgical departments across the United States. Well, when I finished my pediatric and transplant fellowship at Hopkins, I was so happy Extremely happy to have been provided the opportunity to join the Department of Pediatric Surgery at Hopkins and lead the pediatric transplant program. In a nanosecond, I told Dr. Colombani yes. But when I spoke to my wife, Graciela, she asked me a couple of really important questions. The most important was, who were the most important people in my life that have influenced me? And it became readily apparent that she was talking about our parents, our cousins, and enjoying the richness of the Texas-Mexico border. I realized that for me to reach my full potential as an academic surgeon, I also needed a balanced family life. So we moved to San Antonio, where our children could enjoy many of the same life experiences we had in Laredo. So if it was not for that decision, if it was not for that question that Graciela asked me, I would likely have been an excellent pediatric surgeon because I was very well trained, but I would not have been given the opportunity to be president of the UT Health Science Center San Antonio or chancellor of the UT system. And the most important peoples in the lives of our children are their grandparents and their cousins, and their first language was Spanish, as was mine. So I'm very proud that I continue to have a balanced family life. Well, after 9 incredible years as president of the Health Science Center, I accomplished what I wanted to do as an administrator, and I wanted to follow my heart to go back to the life of a full-time surgeon. Little did I know that I was to be called upon to become chancellor of the UT system in 2009. When I was deliberating upon that decision to pursue the chancellorship of the UT system, I spoke to a mentor of mine by the name of Dr. Kenneth Shine, who was at the time the Executive Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs for the UT system. I told Ken I was inclined not to accept the offer because I felt I really needed to get back to the bedside and care for patients. He made a powerful statement, and he said, Francisco, you are going back to the bedside, but as chancellor and as a physician, your patient is the state of Texas. His statement resonated profoundly in my heart. So if not for this guidance from Ken Shine, it's unlikely that the School of Medicine in South Texas would have opened its doors when it did, nor the Dell School of Medicine, because during my tenure, I was able to receive legislative support and regental approval to establish these 2 medical schools. Well, after 15 years of high-impact administration in higher ed, I accomplished my vision and subsequently returned to the full-time life of a surgeon, which, as you know, was a desire that never abated within me. So now I'm the director of transplant surgery at the Health Science Center in San Antonio, and I have the privilege of leading a spectacular team of faculty that personify diversity and inclusion. So in closing, my favorite poem comes to mind, and that poem is entitled The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. So listen to a few of these words. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So on many occasions, I have had to get out of my comfort zone and enter different challenging arenas where failure was a real possibility. Well, I encourage you to take the road less traveled if your reasons are right and if you have an opportunity to improve the lives of others through your service. The world definitely needs your leadership, especially right now, and I'm optimistic about our future because of all of you. Thank you.
I love your survey.
Two great talks, always hard to follow, especially when one of them is responsible for you standing on this podium. Actually, maybe a couple of them, but we'll get to that. So in my few minutes, I want to really personalize this because I think we need more surgeon deans, more pediatric surgeon deans out there. And hopefully this can be a blueprint for some of you who may not be thinking about opportunities that lay ahead. You don't have to just default into your current position, the current position that I am in. because I never aspired to it, to become a dean or let alone a surgeon-in-chief for that matter. But there is a process, there is a path that you can take and that certainly can guide you. But here's mine. I've always been driven by some of the foundational principles that my parents taught me from the time I was very young. It was faith in God. My dad is a preacher, so many of you know that. I also grew up in the church, so that was inescapable. Value of education, it was always about excelling in school, and that's it. If you didn't bring a report card where you were almost, you were at the top of the class, then you didn't really matter to him. That probably is an extreme, but fortunately there was my mother to counterbalance this kind of high expectation. And then the one principle where they never wavered was service to others. And this was something that they inculcated in us from very early on. And it became part of our MO. This is what we saw at home. That's what they practiced. That's what we lived. So I grew up with the notion, how do I make the greatest difference in the lives of others and in my community? This is why Ed mentioned that when we met at 17, and we had visions of trying to, say, change the world, it was really in the context, how do we make a bigger difference in the lives of others? And largely, and also because of this guy, that's why I chose to go into pediatric surgery and really become an academic pediatric surgeon. Not a whole lot of time to go into all the details, but let me just highlight a few key individuals that helped me get to where I am today. And I can't talk about my journey without identifying some critical mentors and sponsors that I've had along the way. Two key people at Princeton who inspired me and made me believe in myself, made me believe that I could become anything I wanted to be. Randall Kennedy, who is now a professor of law at Harvard Law School. And Randall won all the big prizes at Princeton. It was a Rhodes Scholar and so forth. And I said, I was a freshman, he was a senior. I said, well, if he can do this, heck, I can do it too. And Gary Gibbons, who was a junior at Princeton, and I followed him at Harvard Medical School, and Gary is now the director of the NHLBI, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as we know. Again, he was an inspiration and a mentor, and told me all the things that we needed to do to be successful. So fast forward now, we're at Harvard Medical School. I thought I was going to become an internist and go into gastroenterology, and my last major rotation is surgery. And someone decided that I needed to be redressed, and Kurt Newman started on the rotation. Well, he became the chief of the service, and I guess someone must have told him I was going into internal medicine and I wasn't taking surgery, seriously, and he proceeded to make me cry. He embarrassed me to the point where I could only cry. But he tells me he just wanted me to understand that surgical physiology was very, very serious, and I needed to understand that. So, thank you. But the lesson from that was I went home that night. Literally, I never took my jacket off. I took the second chapter I took the Schwartz textbook of surgery, opened it to the second chapter. Back then, that was fluids and electrolytes. And I woke up around 4 o'clock in the morning with the book on my chest, still open, the lights are still on. And I gathered that I must have absorbed everything by osmosis, because by the time I just jumped out of bed and rushed to the hospital, and I was ready to answer all these questions. And this is how my love affair with surgery began, because this man made me cry. Today, the medical students would have filed, a complaint for harassment. But thank you. So that's how it all started. And then, I really fell in love with surgery, and Dick Wilson, I was chief of surgical oncology at the time when the service I was on. He approached me. I remember that one evening after you did that esophagectomy, and it was a 10-hour, Ivor Lewis. I'm waiting to go waiting on the elevator, it's 10 o'clock, and then Dick Simmons walks up to me and says, well, Henri, have you ever considered going into general surgery? I think you'd have a brilliant career in academic surgery. So those of you who have heard me say that story, it's like God was talking to me from heaven, and so I drove to my fiance's house that night and said, forget about internal medicine, I'm going into surgery. So that's how it all happened. So Dr. Wilson became my sponsor. He sent me to Cornell to work with Tom Shires. Really fell in love with the program there. I matched at Cornell. I was also at Sloan Kettering. And Tom Shires sent me to work with Dick Simmons to do surgical immunology. I was set to go to Rockefeller Institute, best immunology program at the time. He said, no, you need to train with a surgical immunologist. So that turned out to be one of the greatest things for me because Dick Simmons really became like my godfather in surgery. And there, I rediscovered my love for pediatric surgery. Mark Rowe put the finishing touches and ultimately trained me in pediatric surgery. And Tim Billier gave me my first job as the chief of surgery there. So I need to acknowledge these individuals because they played such a pivotal role in where I stand today. But the road was not always that easy. It wasn't all rosy. There were a lot of false steps. The first 2 years, I submitted probably 10 grants and all rejected, nothing. I mean, I was on the verge of really saying, maybe this academic surgery thing is not for me. And then on the second try, I got the ACS Faculty Fellowship Award. It was a game changer. It really was transformative because not only did it restore my confidence, it helped me acquire the necessary preliminary data to get my first R01. And from there, we really never looked back. The research program was building when suddenly the head of trauma decided to leave 6 weeks before the trauma site visit, accreditation, and the 22 citations had never been addressed. So the chief of surgery looked at the entire division and said, I need someone to volunteer to step up. This was the least desirable job at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh at the time. So nobody volunteered. And then, so service to others. So I said, okay, well, I'll step up and do this. Even though I recognized it was going to potentially, be somewhat of a setback as far as my research was concerned. But I did get some key concessions from the chief of surgery at the time because we knew he didn't really value trauma that much. The institution didn't. But I had learned a page from my dear friend who was given an assignment that was also extremely undesirable at that time, which was to run the TPN service and intestinal failure service. There was nothing going on at that time. But he turned that into a jewel. So I said, well, if he can do that to, intestinal failure and nutrition, I can turn trauma into something that's better than what it is right now. And indeed, trauma became truly one of the luminary programs of Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and the trustees got interested in it and so on and so forth, and that just completely changed everything. It also set the stage for what happened after that, because when Children's needed to hire a next chief of surgery, they basically told me they didn't want to do a search, they just wanted to know if I wanted to step into that role and be the chief of surgery. But it was also a change, a significant change, because when I met with Dick Simmons, he explained to me my success was not going to be measured by my ability to get that second R1, which was just about, which I'd just gotten, and it wasn't going to be measured by whether or not I cured NEC, but it was really going to be measured by what happened to everybody else on my team. What happened to all the other faculty, what happened to the residents, and in particular, here's the big challenge to you, Henri. No one from Pitt had gone into pediatric surgery for probably the last 20 years because it was felt to be so toxic. So we will know that you're making a difference if our residents start choosing pediatric surgery. So no problem. The bar was very low. Because within 3 years, just about all the top students The top residents wanted to go into pediatric surgery, so much so that Tim Billier called me and said, "What the heck are you doing to me? I need those people in my lab, and they all want to come to children's." So it was very rewarding to see what happened. So the success that I may have enjoyed, I think it's rooted in some of the key leadership principles that I have embraced throughout my life, but which more recently I've refined after reading the biography on Arnold Beckman, one of the greatest chemists of our time. Most of you have heard me talk. I've heard them before, so it's all about excellence. That's the currency that we deal with. No satisfactory substitute for excellence. That's what I expect of myself, and that's what I expect of everyone else. Absolute integrity in everything. If excellence is our currency, it's got to be rooted in integrity. That's got to be the scaffold for your excellence, otherwise you come crashing down. Moderation in everything, including moderation itself. So I have to know when to moderate, but sometimes you just have to say, what the heck, go for it, and do it. Probably the most important of all these, they're all very important, but the fourth bullet, I think, is what Kurt alluded to earlier. Hire the best people, and it's important to stay out of their way. You have to have an outstanding team. If you're going to lead, whether it's as a division chief or department chair, or dean, or CEO, because God did not give you all the wisdom and knowledge. You need to be able to build people around you, that have people around you, hopefully who are smarter than you, people who complement you, because if everybody agrees with you, remember, you don't need them. That's just not helping you. So people who are going to be confident enough to be able to challenge you, people who are going to be able to have their own thoughts. You want leaders around you, not managers. And then the last bullet, which I always like, is don't take yourself too seriously. You have to be approachable. People cannot view you as this, whatever, demigod or someone you cannot really get access to. So by your willingness to make fun of your big head or funny accent allows them to be able to share with you their own thoughts and help give you some critical insight. So since I emphasized the importance of building a team, a strong team, so those are the things that I personally look for. There may be others. It's not complete, it's not exhaustive, but those are the critical things. So intelligence. And intelligence is not measured just by your board scores. It's not measured by, whether or not you went to Yale or Harvard or anything like that. No, those are not the things. Those are not the measures of intelligence. Intelligence is reflected in what people's trajectory has been, what they have had to overcome, how they managed to get to their position. Also love you want people who are curious, people who are going to challenge the status quo, because it's not about accepting things, all the dogmas and everything else. So somebody has to be able to say, is there a possibility that we could be doing something differently? Could it be better? And it's not enough to just leave it there, but you want the people who have the creativity to come up with a different hypothesis as to how things could be done, and then to go out there and test it. But a lot of times after we test that new hypothesis, you're going to fail. It's going to fail multiple times. And you cannot just quit because you failed. And this is why tenacity, the grit factor, becomes so critical. And I've said it before, I don't want people who I don't really need in my senior executive team. In my senior cabinet, I don't want managers, I need leaders. The leaders are the people who are going to bring forward new ideas, new concepts, and who are going to be able to execute them. You still need managers because people have to do things, but in your senior cabinet, the people who are talking in your ears and coming up with the critical ideas, you need true leaders. And recognize that you cannot have leadership without followership, so we need people who have social adroitness, the ability to inspire others to actually follow them. And of course, you need to be laced with humility. So I think those are the critical things that I look for when I'm trying to build my own team wherever I've gone. As a servant leader, it's important to consider what it is or who we are working for. Truth be told, I said it from the very beginning. I never dreamed in my life that I was going to be a dean or I was going to be a surgeon-in-chief. I remember when Ed and I used to talk, and he said, my goal, whether it was in medical school or during our exchanges in residency, was maybe if everything went well, by the time I'm in my 50s, perhaps I may become division chief of some surgery, in some place, in some department of surgery. And certainly forget about dean, but it all happened. It all happened to me, and I can tell you why it all happened. It happened because I've always been driven by the desire to improve the condition of others. It's always been about service to others, and this is how you get elevated. So never lose perspective on who your true constituents are, because these are the people you have to serve. These are the people who are going to ultimately empower you. So to the extent that you always know who it is that you should be serving, and you're not looking at for self, you are going to find you're going to wake up one morning and you find yourself the dean or something even better, or CEO or chancellor. I do believe that formal leadership training is important, whether it's by reading books about leadership, which is what I did for the first couple of years after I was promoted, or ultimately by obtaining an MHA or an MBA. I think this was really very, very vital to my own effectiveness as a leader, because knowledge of finances is crucial in order for you to be able to deal with the CEO and the CFO who are going to start talking about EBITDA, they start talking about margins, they start talking about indices and all this. They're just trying to intimidate you. But remember, okay, you're a pediatric surgeon. You're like the finest of, you're the cream of the crop. Don't let the CEO, except for this one, intimidate you. So I think that's why this kind of formal training is important, because then it equips you with the tools necessary to be quite effective in the boardroom. Because when a surgeon or a dean who happens to be a surgeon, they start talking about EBITDA, everybody starts looking around and say, whoa, we know we have somebody serious. We know we have to pay attention to what this person, because he or she knows what they're talking about. And lastly, as a leader, we have to remember it's not really about the IQ. We have a lot of brilliant people who just don't end up being successful because they lack the emotional intelligence. And this is something that I have to deal with chairs, with some of the chairs in my current role. Yes, I hire you because I want your department to become one of the top 10 in the country. But it doesn't mean you go in there and you just tell half of the people that they are completely idiots and they don't belong here. That's just not the way you do it. That's not the way you deliver a message. So IQ is important, but how you communicate with people, how you give bad information, how you give them bad news is just as important, and that's something that we have to practice as leaders. So we have to focus on not just on the key performance indices, but also the key happiness indices, because that's how people know that you really care. To the extent that the faculty, the chairs, the staff, the students know that you are concerned about their well-being, their happiness, not just the bottom line alone, then they're going to jump out of bed to come and work. They're going to be, because they feel empowered. So those are very, very, very important principles that we have to embody as leaders. And this is my last slide. You have to make sure that everyone's voice is heard before making a final decision. It cannot be a top-down approach, because especially in our field where everybody is an overachiever, we're talking about, just imagine the competition that people had to go through to get to medical school, number one, and then to become a board-certified physician or surgeon and so forth. So you're not talking to, average people. These are people who are superb. So it's important for them to feel heard. So you may not agree with them, but everyone needs to be heard before you make the final decision, because ultimately you're still accountable for what happens. But listen first. Let the constituents take ownership of the goals and objectives to the extent that they feel that they had some input and they help frame where we're going. they will carry out the vision more readily. But ultimately, as the leader, you still have to drive the process and execution. And one thing we don't ever do enough of is to recognize people, to recognize achievement, however small it may be, celebrate those achievements, and encourage others. That's really how they get pumped up, and this is what makes them want to jump out of bed to come and work and give the institution their very best. But while we do all those things, the higher you go, recognize that you have to manage up. You have to keep the CEO and the board chairs happy, because at the end of the day, they change deans and CEOs for no good reason. So you have to maintain a good line of communication. They need to be your allies. They may not always agree, but to the extent that you maintain the doors of communication and you keep doing all the right things, you're going to be in good shape. But never forget your primary constituents, faculty, and chairs. Thank you.
So standing up here is a bit surreal for me. May 1997, 25 years ago, I graduated from medical school. So I'm right at halfway through my life. Dr. Crummell, who I believe is here, wrote my letter for surgery to match. I matched at Downstate in Brooklyn, and the first person to expose me to pediatric surgery was Dr. Francesca Velchek and Brian Gilchrist, and they showed me the love of children like no other, where I saw some disparities firsthand that I'll never forget, like a child who became obtunded as soon as they came in the ER. I couldn't figure out why, and there was pus draining out of her ear from an ear infection that had caused a midline shift and a herniation that we had to intubate immediately to get a craniotomy to drain an abscess for an ear infection. And that October of 1997, I went to American College of Surgeons meeting because I had no money and it was free to go as a resident. And by then I had decided I was going to be a pediatric surgeon. So I sat in at all the surgical forums for pediatric surgery, and I saw Sherlyn Gordon, may she rest in peace, present at surgical forum. And she was this beautiful, smart, electric Black woman who had taken full command of this room. And when she was done, I ran up to her and I said, "How did you learn how to do that? Who taught you how to do that?" And she pointed to Henri. And that was 25 years ago. And I went up to him and I said, "I'm going to be a pediatric surgeon." And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Ayla Stanford." "And what year are you?" And I said, "I'm an intern." And he said, "Okay, so you've been a doctor for 4 months?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I've been a doctor." And he said, "You're too young, call me in a year." I said, "Okay." I went back to Brooklyn. I operated with Dr. Velchek. I did my first ovarian teratoma with her. I still remember her name, Nina Ma. She let me do the entire case. And I said, "Do you know this Dr. Ford person?" And she, "Oh, yes." And I wrote to him and I said, "You said to call you in a year. So it's a year and I'm calling." And he said, "Well, no one can come into my lab without research, without funding. You can't just come." I said, "Well, what do I need to do?" So I had to write a grant. Now, back then, I would write something, I'd FedEx it to him, he would FedEx it back to me with the corrections, I'd send it back, and then subsequently, the training grant was approved or granted, and now I could go to the University of Pittsburgh. And I went to my program director and I said, "I got a research opportunity at pediatric surgery." And he looked at me and said, "If you leave this program, I will not guarantee your categorical position in pediatric surgery." And I was crushed, and I called Henri, and he said to me, I can give you an environment where you can flourish, but only you know what you're capable of. And sometimes you have to step out on faith. And I was 26 years old, and I packed up and I left, and I moved to University of Pittsburgh. And when I got to Pittsburgh, I had a family. And Dr. Upperman, who on Friday would say, there was an exit procedure, here are the articles, here are the pictures, get some references, I want a paper on Monday. Yes, sir, Dr. Upperman. And that's what I did. Dr. Barksdale was writing chapters on TPN and nutrition. We have an opportunity to submit a chapter here. I need you to get this written. That's what I did. Dr. Atkins and Barb Gaines taking call. I lived in the hospital. If I wasn't in the hospital, I was in the lab. That's what I did. And then in the lab with Evan Nadler and Doug Patoka, they encouraged me. We were competitive. We worked hard against one another. But Dr. Ford, he never had us compete against each other. So when it was time for us to go into the match, he was able to support each one of us ferociously and not so we had to compete against one another. Pittsburgh was different than Brooklyn. You know, I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, and downstate was a strong clinical program. I mean, I felt like I could operate on anything. When I got to Pittsburgh, it was very strongly academic and less surgical. And I was in this place where people didn't know me. After being prolific in the lab, presenting at every surgical meeting, publishing everything that was submitted, Tim Billier offered me a position to stay as a categorical resident. Now, throughout this time, I would say to Henri, I don't have a job. I know we're publishing these papers, but I don't have a job. So here's lesson number 2. And he would say, do your work. As long as you're working hard, a job will come to you. We were literally at an SUS meeting over a buffet, and Tim Billier said, nice presentation. How are things going? I said, well, things are going good, but I don't have a job. And he said, when we get back to Pittsburgh, let's talk about that. And then I did. So, as I said, it was different in Pittsburgh. I don't think they knew what to do with me. There had never been a Black woman resident. There were things on my evaluations like, she smiles too much. She's pathologically happy. Something's wrong. And it was not easy for me. I will say that. I would have evaluations in person that said, great job, looking forward to you advancing, but then on paper, it was something totally different that I was expected to sign, which I did not. And again, I went to Henri, and he said, you do your work. You do your work. And so, I forgot to show you this. These are all my remarks. But in essence, my entire journey and career has been, how do I dispel a subjective narrative with objective data? And so I was coming from a strong clinical program. And again, as I told you, I was an enigma for the University of Pittsburgh. And so how I dispelled that I belong there, because that's what it was. You don't belong, we didn't choose you, is I worked hard. The patient outcomes displayed what I was capable of. My ABSITE scores displayed what I was capable of. Publishing the papers displayed what I was capable of. And I very quickly realized that I did not need someone to tell me, good job, because they were not going to tell me, good job. But I could see when I was accepted to every surgical forum, every SUS presentation, every SBAS presentation, and that things were getting printed, that I knew I was doing a good job. When I got 90th percentile on my in-service, I knew I was doing a good job. And so the subjective narrative of the not belonging, I was able to overcome with the objective data. And then I matched in pediatric surgery, and the first person to hug me in the hallway was Ben. And I was like, I did it. And I was so excited and elated. And I finished, and off to Cincinnati I went. And one of the best training programs, and I learned so much. And Eugene, Kim, the best senior fellow, I am claiming, the best senior fellow. And I learned so much from him. The biggest thing I learned was that whenever things got crazy, he got calmer and calmer and calmer. And it was one of the best traits that I picked up. And he and Rich Falcone were like Batman and Robin, and then they included me as Catwoman. That was a big deal. And they put a sign on the door when I came in one day. I'm like, Rich, you graduated. You're messing up my fellow vibe here because you're still around. And they said, okay, Catwoman, and that was great. And that was a great year. And then Eugene left, and I was devastated, I'll tell you. And I don't know if you've ever been in a place where there might be 6 people or 6 faculty members, and 6 people love you, and 6 people feel like you don't belong here. And that's a lot like what it was for me. And so when Eugene left, it was hard. And then Mark Levitt and Dr. Pena showed up. And they saw me. And when Dr. Pena first came, he was getting his license and all this stuff in Ohio, and he couldn't operate yet. And so you went to the operating room with him, and he didn't scrub, and he stood behind your shoulder and told you everything to do without touching a patient. And those were my hands that got to do those procedures. And then when he could operate and be across the table, as long as you could tell him the next step, he let me do the case. That validated me. When myself and Mark and he were at the scrub sink, one day Mark said, man, a Jew, a Mexican, and a Black woman. We are diversity. And they reignited my love for pediatric surgery. And they validated my skill set, my strength, my proudness, and I knew there was nothing that I couldn't do. And then, obviously, I graduated. Now, to the notes. That was the journey. The lessons. Hard work will solve 90% of your problems. The other 10%, you just have to let go. Dr. Asa Yancey said that to me in 2001. Everyone does not have to like you, but they need to respect you. They must respect me. Choose your battles. I don't waste time on finite relationships or on people or situations that don't affect my joy, my trajectory, or my money. Success means something different for everyone. When I chose to go into a more community-based and health equity lens for my pediatric surgery career, I wrote a 6-page letter to Henri. And I wanted him to know that I had appreciated everything he had done for me in academic medicine and doing my research and so forth. And I did it to get where I wanted to be, but I really wanted to be in the community, and I didn't want to let him down. And when he told me it was okay, I felt like I just exhaled. And I got to Temple, my first job in Philly, and I became the director of Minority Health and Health Disparities, and I loved it in surgery. And then the last lesson I can say again, and these are things, honestly, I learned from Ed and I learned from Henri, is just that don't wait for people to tell you good job and pat you on the back. You might be waiting a really, really long time for that, right? But you see your patients getting better, right? You see when you're at the mall and someone says, hey, look, here's my scar, remember? You know. Now I see moms at track meets with my own kids that are coming up to me sobbing, you operated on her when she was 2, now look at her. And that's how you know you're doing a good job. Current day. And it's even hard for me today because I listen to so many of the social determinants of health in the DEI lectures. And in March of 2020, when I was home like all of you, and CNN kept saying that African Americans were more likely to die and more likely to contract COVID, and they kept saying it's because they have chronic health conditions and because they don't trust their doctor and because they don't go to the doctor and because they have more diabetes and more hypertension. It felt like 25 years ago sitting in medical school hearing the same thing. It felt like that a little bit today hearing the same thing about gun violence and about recidivism and about appointment making and compliance. And I said, but there's a big piece that we're missing, and that's access. Because I'm from Philly, and everyone was calling me saying, I have these symptoms, I think I have COVID, but I went to the ER and they sent me home. Or I called my doctor and I can't get a referral, and so I spent all my staying at home days sheltering in place, calling ER saying, you just turned away Mr. Johnson, he meets criteria, he needs a COVID test. I did that all day, every day, and every time I did it, someone had COVID. And they weren't poor and black, they were educated and black with insurance being turned away from the hospitals. And so when I hear the lectures, and I encourage all of you that are reporting it, present 1 or 2 solutions, because it's very despondent. And so for me, when I watched it, I said, no. This is access, access, and access. And so I took what I had in my armamentarium to do something about it, and that's where the testing came in. With the PPE from my office, to go to communities and zip codes where the positivity rate was the highest, and to test and contact trace. And then the vaccines came, and because we had built this trust in a community where everyone said they don't trust the doctor, no, it's that the healthcare system has been untrustworthy. And when you say that, it flips it. It takes the onus off the patient and the individual and puts some responsibility on a healthcare system that has been untrustworthy. People didn't wake up one day and say, you know what? I think I'm not going to trust my doctor. You know, bad things happened before all of us were born, and we have to include that as we take care of our patients. And I understand that as a clinician. I understood that as a patient, as a child, recognizing that we missed appointments because my mom was working, that we used the ER for my visit to go back to school and to get my shots because the offices were closed and she worked 2 jobs. That's why I couldn't get to the doctor on time. And taking all of that knowledge and the grit that comes from being a surgeon, not accepting no, having a plan A, B, and C to say, this is how we can fix this. And I did it. And we started the vaccination campaign, vaccinated over 55,000 people, and tested over 25,000 people, grassroots. No money from the city, the state, the federal government, just my bank account. All of you all, by the way, who donated and GoFundMe, so thank you very, very much. And that's how it happened. And I just feel, as I said, humbled, full circle, that honestly, 25 years ago, someone looked at me and saw something more than everyone else may not have seen in that moment. That over the last 5, 10 years, that my coach has been Dr. Barksdale, that I can text and call and whatever, and thank you, Michelle, for letting me borrow him for that. And I'm humbled. And if I could say to you all how you dispel a subjective narrative, when you're looking at those applicants that come across your desk and your buddy has called you and said, not her. She's not smart enough. Because you know they all do it. It was done to me. Look at the objective data. Look at what they've published. Look at their board scores. Look at what they've done in the community. Look at how they've changed or touched a life. Look at the emotional quotient, not just the IQ. And just do your best to whatever the subjective thing is that we all carry, our own internal biases, that we try to use an objective lens to see it just a little differently. And I really believe that that's how we not just make a change in the OR, but we make changes in people's lives, their families' lives, and lifetimes. Thank you very much. Place to be. Sorry, I think I was 12 minutes.
For all of you. My mother says that when you're humbled, you should not speak. You should just pay reverence to greatness. And these are 4 great leaders, the types of leaders that I called boundary-spanning leaders, the types of leaders who, for me, have not just touched me physically or academically, but through my private relationships with each of them in very quiet places, have touched me spiritually. And I say spiritually from the perspective that our spirit is our purpose, and so they've helped me learn to lead with purpose. And I hope we're over time, I hope that you have gleaned something from this session about the concepts of leadership from 4 very distinct individuals with very different backgrounds. But leadership is diverse. And so I thank you all. I think we have a moment for maybe 2 questions. We won't have the breakout rooms because we're over. Are there any questions from the audience? Dr. Van Leeuwen?
I was just going to say, I'm sure there is time for people to meet
Oh,
them.
there's time? Good.
Well, I can confirm with Kim and Marina, but out on the patio, there's an
Great.
area where we can join and everyone can meet you. You actually need handlers, so we'll be out there to have people get a chance to say hi to you. But if that's okay, Ed, we could move there.
I work for you. So it's absolutely okay. So I would like to invite people to the areas outside. If there's no major questions from the audience, this has been phenomenal. So if you would join me in just a round of brief applause for our guests.
Thank you so much.